At the start of the 18th century, Europe was already tense, heavily armed, and deeply suspicious of any ruler becoming too powerful. Then one death turned that tension into a continent-wide war. Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king of Spain, died in 1700 without children. That single fact created an enormous political problem, because Spain was not just one kingdom. It was still a vast empire with territories in Europe, the Americas, and beyond. Whoever inherited Spain would not simply gain a crown. They would gain access to strategic ports, colonial wealth, and influence across the Mediterranean and Atlantic worlds. The question was not only who had the strongest legal claim. The real question was whether Europe could survive if Spain's empire fell under the influence of either France or Austria. The two main claimants represented Europe's most powerful dynastic blocks. On one side stood Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV of France. If Philip became king of Spain, the French Bourbon dynasty would control both France and Spain, or at least bind them closely together. On the other side stood Archduke Charles of Austria, a Habsburg claimant backed by those who feared French domination. For decades, France under Louis XIV had pursued power aggressively, alarming neighboring states. But Austria was also a major imperial force. So the succession was dangerous in either direction. A Bourbon Spain looked like French encirclement of Europe. A Habsburg Spain could restore the old Habsburg network that had once surrounded France. Neither option felt safe to everyone else. Charles II named Philip of Anjou as his successor, and in November 1700 Philip was proclaimed King Philip V of Spain. Louis XIV accepted the inheritance, presenting it as a legitimate dynastic settlement. But other European powers saw a much larger threat. If France and Spain cooperated as one political bloc, they could dominate trade routes, colonial access, and military strategy across Western Europe. The fear was not necessarily that France and Spain would immediately merge into one state. The fear was that their shared Bourbon family interest would make them function like one. In an age when royal marriages and inherited claims shaped international politics, a shared dynasty could be almost as important as a formal union. That fear helped turn a succession dispute into war. The response was the Grand Alliance, a coalition built to prevent France from gaining overwhelming power. Its members included Austria, England, the Dutch Republic, and other partners at different stages of the conflict. Their goals were not always identical, but they shared one core concern: the balance of power. This phrase mattered deeply in early modern Europe. It meant that no single state, monarch, or dynasty should become strong enough to dictate terms to the rest. The Dutch feared French pressure on their borders and trade. England, later Britain after the 1707 union with Scotland, feared French influence over maritime commerce and colonial competition. Austria wanted its own candidate on the Spanish throne. The alliance held together because each member saw a Bourbon Spain as a strategic danger. The war that followed was not confined to Spain. It spread across Europe and across the Atlantic world. Fighting took place in the Spanish Netherlands, Italy, Germany, Spain itself, and in colonial theaters connected to what became known in North America as Queen Anne's War. This global dimension is crucial. Spain's empire made the succession question international by default. Control over Spanish territories meant control over ports, shipping lanes, tax revenues, and commercial privileges. Armies fought over fortresses and provinces, but merchants and naval planners watched just as closely. The conflict was partly about dynastic legitimacy, but it was also about access, trade, and strategic position. The future of Europe's colonial and commercial order was tied directly to who controlled the Spanish inheritance. At first, the Grand Alliance hoped to force the Bourbon claimant out of Spain and install Archduke Charles. France, already strained by years of war, was pushed onto the defensive in several theaters. The Allies won important victories and placed heavy pressure on Louis XIV. Yet war on paper is not the same as control on the ground. Philip V gradually strengthened his position inside Spain, where many people accepted him as king or preferred him to a foreign-backed alternative. This mattered enormously. A succession war could not be won only by battles in Flanders or Italy. The claimant had to rule Spain itself. By 1709, even as France suffered, Philip's hold over Spain had become much harder to break. The longer the war continued, the more the central issue shifted. At the beginning, the question seemed to be whether Philip or Charles would rule Spain. But as the years dragged on, the division of Spanish territories became just as important. European powers began thinking less about a complete victory and more about compensation. If Philip remained king, what territories would be removed from Spanish control? If Austria could not win the Spanish crown, could it gain Spanish possessions in Italy or the Netherlands? If Britain continued funding and fighting the war, what naval or commercial prizes would justify the cost? War aims became bargaining positions. The conflict increasingly turned into a negotiation fought with armies, fleets, subsidies, and exhausted treasuries. Then, in 1711, the political logic of the war changed dramatically. Emperor Joseph I died, and Archduke Charles, the Grand Alliance candidate for Spain, became Holy Roman Emperor. This created a new problem. If Charles also became King of Spain, then Austria and Spain could be united under a Habsburg ruler. For many allies, that outcome was hardly better than the Bourbon danger they had been fighting against. The war had been justified as a struggle to prevent one dynasty from becoming too powerful. Now the anti-French candidate risked creating exactly the kind of imbalance the coalition claimed to oppose. This did not instantly end the fighting, but it badly weakened the moral and strategic case for continuing the war at any cost. Britain's role became decisive because Britain had supplied military power, naval strength, and financial support to the alliance. But by the early 1710s, the war was expensive, politically controversial, and increasingly difficult to justify. A new British government was less committed to continuing the conflict indefinitely. British leaders began to see more value in a negotiated settlement that secured maritime and commercial advantages than in fighting to install Charles in Spain. This was a major turning point. Alliances depend not only on shared enemies, but also on shared endurance. Once Britain moved toward peace, the Grand Alliance lost a central pillar. Other allies continued fighting for a time, but without British money and support, the path to a broad settlement became unavoidable. The main settlement came with the Peace of Utrecht in 1713, followed by the treaties of Rastatt and Baden in 1714. These agreements did not simply declare a winner. They restructured the inheritance. Philip V was confirmed as King of Spain, but he renounced any claim to the French throne. This was meant to prevent a future union of France and Spain under one monarch. At the same time, Spain lost important European possessions. Austria gained the Austrian Netherlands and several former Spanish holdings in Italy. Savoy also received territory. The result was a compromise. The Bourbon dynasty stayed in Madrid, but the Spanish Empire in Europe was reduced and redistributed to calm the balance of power fears that had caused the war. Britain emerged with especially important gains. It retained Gibraltar and Minorca, two strategic Mediterranean positions that strengthened British naval reach. Gibraltar in particular became a symbol of Britain's growing maritime power, controlling access between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. Britain also gained commercial advantages that helped it expand as a global trading power. The Dutch Republic, once one of Europe's leading commercial and naval forces, began to decline in relative importance. This shift was one of the war's great long-term consequences. The conflict had started over the Spanish throne, but it helped accelerate Britain's rise as Europe's leading naval and commercial power. The map of power was changing, not only on land, but also at sea. The War of the Spanish Succession ended without giving any side everything it wanted. France was financially exhausted, but Louis XIV achieved a major dynastic goal. A Bourbon remained on the Spanish throne, breaking the old Habsburg encirclement of France. Austria did not get Spain, but it gained valuable territories. Britain did not place its preferred candidate in Madrid, but it gained naval bases and commercial leverage that mattered even more in the long run. Spain kept its monarchy under Philip V, but its European empire was reduced. The war showed how dynastic politics, military power, trade, empire, and balance of power thinking were all connected. One king's death had forced Europe to redraw the limits of ambition. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.